Well, our family moved to Del Mar because my father had a new position. I was about 12 at the time. We, my sister and I, were not at all happy about the move. We were quite settled in Alaska and very happy with our lives and childhood freedoms there. But the move was difficult in a lot of ways that we had not anticipated. We knew we would miss our friends and our old life. We didn't know we would encounter racism. We didn't know really what that was. And we had been raised to think of ourselves and others as equal, had been taught certain values about how people should be treated, and didn't really know in isolation in Alaska how different things were in the rest of the United States. This is the 50s. So my parents tried to protect us from the journey that they went through looking for housing. We stayed with my grandmother, we had a good time there, and really knew very little about what they were going through. But having arrived ourselves, we began to discover that this was not paradise. My parents were anxious about how we would be treated, how they would be treated. Some of this I know, I have to say, in hindsight, from working on the book that my mother and Arlen Westbrook wrote.
I had always kept a journal as a way of keeping my head straight. And Margaret also was a journal keeper. Then we shared our journals with each other and put them in a file and forgot about them for 50 years. Miki, who was very competent, pulled the two manuscripts together and formatted them. They were in kind of funny shapes, carbon paper, handwriting, and so on. And she coordinated this and got this book printed, Integrating Del Mar, the Story of a Friendship. We had become friends.
Then I began to really understand what my mother was going through. But at the time, we created a safe area in Arlen's home. And that was very comforting, a very happy home space. But when I would go out from home is when I would see how people were raised differently. So I was a teenager, 12 going on 13. Children were not allowed to have relationships with me. They were not allowed to talk to me, to bring me home to their house. I did not feel welcome to bring them home to my house. Then I began to notice the teachers treated me a little differently, that in social studies, whenever we talked about slavery, teachers would say something like, well, you're a Negro, Miki, what do your people think about that? And I never thought of myself as a representative of all of my people. At the time, we were just kids among kids, at least, coming from Alaska. So there were a number of experiences that brought home the separation between the races. Had one friend in middle school who was a friend because his parents went to the same church that our family went to, which was the Unitarian Church in Albany. He invited me home to his house, proceeded to insult me in, I guess, all the ways he could think of. And when I didn't respond kindly to that, he said, "What's wrong? You people are supposed to be happy-go-lucky and nothing ever bothers you." And at that time, having not had these kind of experiences before, I didn't really have good comebacks. Now I can say, I should have said, or I wish I had said. But at the time, was speechless at the kind of things that went on. I saw also that the adults were hypocritical, comes to mind. We were raised in Alaska in a Unitarian community that my parents and several of their neighbors organized. And it was very, how could I say? It was not institutional. It happened in each other's kitchens and houses and so on. So coming to a church, my parents were looking forward to being a part of that organized structure and not having to plan Sunday activities every week. I was looking forward to that. If these were Unitarians, then the kids would be good kids and kids that I could enjoy. And so, to our shock, when we went to meet the minister as a new family joining the church, he had a big Confederate flag behind his desk. And somehow, and I'm not sure what the connections were, but I did know and understand that the Confederate flag meant danger to Black people. So I was very alarmed to see that there and thought, how could a minister, a Unitarian minister, have a Confederate flag behind his desk? And my parents were concerned too. They didn't say anything during the course of that meeting, but listening in on parents' discussions, they talked about it on the way home and were not too happy about that. We joined the church anyway, and my parents did find like-minded people there. I did not. And I think partly because teenage years are a difficult time anyway. And I did not fit in, could not be part of that community. Civil rights came into my life as a source of activity when I went to college. The first thing, even though I said I was an independent thinker, and I was a thinker, but I did obey my parents in certain ways. So when we were thinking about college, they told me that I had only two choices as far as they were concerned. I could stay in the Albany area and go to SUNY, which at that time was State University of New York or something like that. Or I could go to Howard University, which was a historically Black college. They felt that my experience as the only Black child in not elementary, but high school, middle school, needed to be balanced by going to a Black college. I had no interest in going to a Black college myself. I had friends that I had made at summer camp, which was, a very leftist summer camp. And those friends from camp, which was back in Michigan, they were the only friends I had. So they were my only peer group, and they were going to places like Oberlin and, more liberal colleges. I didn't know anything about black colleges, except that my parents had both gone to Howard, which for a teenager is not necessarily a recommendation. But I decided that I definitely wasn't going to stay in Albany. So therefore, the only choice was Howard. And I did go to Howard. I have to say that it was a perfect solution and a perfect decision. And once I got there, I saw that my parents did have their heads on right. That it was a good piece of decision making on their part to send me there. So I got involved in the civil rights movement very quickly at Howard. I was in one class when a fellow student who I had not yet met came into the class with flyers, and he said, he was going from person to person. The teacher hadn't come yet, and he timed it so that students were coming in. And he went from student to student and asked, would you be willing to risk your life for your civil rights? And most of the students were blowing him off. They were like, get out of my face. I'm not interested. But when it got to me, I said, yes, I would. And so he handed me flyers. He said, come to this meeting on such and such a date. We're planning a demonstration. This'll, go and you'll find all about it. And I did. I went to, it was a big church. I don't remember the name of it. Big church in Washington, D.C. There they taught about nonviolence, how to be in a demonstration and be nonviolent. They taught us freedom songs because we needed those freedom songs to help us be strong, to help us stay focused. And we were given a lot of information to prepare us for this. That was my first demonstration. The plan was that we would get arrested, that there would be mass arrests, that we would be intentionally doing things that were against the law at that time, and that nothing could be guaranteed as far as the outcome was concerned, that we were taking our lives into our own hands. Might be fine, it might not be fine. By then I knew things that had happened in the South, the early freedom rides, the buses being burned, the civil rights activists prior to me who had been killed. And, so all of this we knew, but we also knew that we needed to show the world the injustice that was going on, and we needed to support each other in this effort. Now, it was a very interracial effort. There were white students from everywhere, from out of town, and local students who had agreed to participate. And there must have been, the day of the demonstration, about 6 buses, the big school buses, filled with people. Each bus had a song leader. We sang until we were hoarse all the way there. We went to Cambridge, Maryland. I decided we could decide individually which of several activities you were going to do. And I decided that I would go to a cafe and sit with white people and see if we could be served. And the plan was that if we were not served, we would simply stay seated. That if the police came, we would simply stay seated, and they would have to get us out however they could, but we would not participate in walking out in assisting them in any way. So I, as a light-skinned black person, discovered that there were lots of white people who were not sure exactly what I was. They seemed to know that I was not the run-of-the-mill white, but they weren't quite sure what I in fact was. So when I went into the cafe and sat down with a group of white people who were already seated there, who were also on the bus, the waiter came up and looked at us and looked at me and looked at them. And finally, she asked me directly, are you a Negro? And I said, yes, I am. And she said, well, it's against the law to sit here with white people. It's against the law for you to even be in here. And I said, so I've heard. And she said, well, you need to leave. And I said, no, thank you. I'm going to stay right here. And eventually the police did come. We didn't get served, of course. The police did come, and they carried us out, not violently. They knew by then that these busloads were there, that the press was there, and so on. So I think that they were trying to be strategic in how they got us out of there. We survived it. We were not injured, but we were scared the whole time. The demonstrations that came after that one were less scary because, having gone through it once, we had a sense of what the process was, what we could expect, and so on. But there were some that turned violent. I myself, fortunately, did not happen to be at any of the violent ones. But my husband, which my junior year, I got married to a fellow student who was also a civil rights activist. And he went to several demonstrations that I did not go to. And in one of them, he was dragged down the middle of the street and had injuries that stayed with him for all of the rest of his life. So, it was very real that you didn't know what was going to happen. But it was an important part of our lives. The organization of students became affiliates of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. We had an organization in Washington, D.C. called the Nonviolent Action Group. I became secretary to that group. And we got to meet people throughout the whole United States who, when they would come to Washington, would come meet with us with NAG. Many stayed at my house after I got married. It was kind of home away from home and a respite place for the people who were activists farther south, who had more pressures and tensions on them. Now, was it my junior year also, I think, was the March on Washington. So I stayed every summer while I was in college in Washington. And I heard that the March on Washington was being planned. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was very involved, and NAG, our affiliate, was very involved because it was going to take place in Washington, D.C. So all of us became volunteers at the planning and organization of it. I, as a young student, had sort of the errand girl role. And this was, I have to say, also at the time that the women's movement was beginning. So looking back on it, I see that a lot of us females accepted roles that we probably would not accept so graciously today. But so we ran errands, we made calls for food to be delivered, made coffee. We could express our opinion, and we did, but we did not have the same level of respect and equality that the men did. And that was true throughout the movement. What I realized looking back is that the way that a march of such huge numbers was planned and organized at that time was so different from how we plan things today. Computers were not in everybody's hands. Cell phones had not yet been invented. There was not a lot of mass communication at our fingertips. So we used a lot of paper, we wrote, we copied things, we mass mailed things. Each state had information that they wanted to have available to pass out so that people coming from that state could find out what else was going on in their area, what groups were organizing, what activities were planned for the future. So the March on Washington was not just a demonstration, but an opportunity for all people who were activists to find out what else was going on, what was going on where, how you could get involved, and so on. So the day finally came for the March on Washington to actually take place. As one of the volunteers, I got there early in the morning before the sun was up. It was foggy, it was dark, you couldn't see more than 3 or 4 feet in front of you, but we found our way to the information booth, and that's where I would be parked. The information booth was filled with boxes and boxes of all these papers that we had been working on. And our job was to organize the papers in the information booth. It was also, if somebody got lost or people got separated, it was kind of a place that you could find your way to and get help. So that's what I spent my time doing. We could hear some of the speeches, but the sound quality was not as good as it is today. They didn't have those big, what do they call them? The big screens where you could see from where you are what was going on. None of that was there. So from the information booth, what I saw was seas of people. Just people as far as my eyes could go. In fact, at one point, the woman who was in charge of the information booth said, "Miki, you might as well go ahead and take a break. You've been here for hours." And I looked out at that sea of people and I said, "No, I think I'll stay right here." It was a lot more comfortable.
Yeah.
My parents came down to the March on Washington. There was a bus or several buses from the Albany area, and they were determined to find me. I had told them I'd be at the information booth, and eventually they did find it and turned up. So that was really, it was wonderful to see them in that circumstance, to know that we as a family were committed to this kind of work. My little sister was there, and she decided she'd had enough of the crowd, so she came, crawled under, and joined me in the information booth. It was, so the speeches I didn't get to hear until a few days later, when we were able to play the tapes and hear from people who had been right up front or been a part of that, all of the events that were actually taking place. But it was, I think, an event that got me started being an organizer, that I, in my adult careers, have always wound up organizing things. And it runs in our family as well. My mother always was an organizer, and I followed in her footsteps in that respect. But I had a lot of practical experience in learning how to be an organizer by working on the March on Washington. Along with the civil rights movement came the Black Arts movement. And I became a part of the Black Arts movement. I had a double major in college, art and sociology. So being an artist, studying art there, it was quite natural, being on Howard's campus, that the Black Arts movement was a subject for discussion and to see where we felt and how we felt. And what I felt is that it was another tool that I had to use as a resource to talk about what life was like between the races and what life could be like, and to talk about how we needed to see ourselves and each other as beautiful and as strong and be proud of our connection to Africa. That was something that people were, prior to this, ashamed of, embarrassed by. And so, we began wearing afros, and wearing our hair natural, wearing clothes that were reflective of our heritage and feeling pride in that. So that was how I was involved in the Black Arts movement. Everything, of course, was up to debate, and at one time I was asked to include my artwork. This was after graduation. I moved to Boston. To include my artwork in an exhibit, a Black Arts exhibit that was being held there. And people objected to my art who were planning it because they didn't feel that it was angry enough. And I pointed out that if we're to think of ourselves as beautiful and as strong, it doesn't necessarily mean we have to be angry or portray ourselves as angry, that our very lives, what we do in the kitchen, how we love our children, well, all of these things are part of who we are, and that those are things that my art is about Black people, but because my heart is in the family, that my art has a lot to do with family structure and family activities. And maybe that was the appeal of sociology to me as well, that I had those two sides which fit together, as far as I'm concerned, very well. and continue to. But it was, there are those who were rigid about how they saw what we should be doing. And that debate continues to today, that writers try to decide, are they black authors or are they authors who happen to be black? And where should their books be? Should they be with the rest of fiction if they're writing fiction, or should black fiction be in a separate place? So those are the debates that we were dealing with at that time. Another part was who we socialized with. And I found that the way I had grown up, I was open to be friendly with anyone who was friendly with me. But when the civil rights movement changed from a focus on integration to black power, some of the dynamics changed and some of the relationships changed. So, as I said, in that first march that I went to, it was a very mixed crowd. But when we began talking about black power, it was harder and harder to see how the mixing was going to work out. And there were, my husband, I don't know if I mentioned it or not, but he was white. So, and he had been very active from the time he had started at Howard University, very active in the civil rights movement, and most of his friends were black. So when we moved to Boston, there was a time that our house was the place where people stayed when we were in Washington, D.C. Now it just moved north, and it was still a place where people would come to stay if they were giving a speech in the Boston area or planning an activity. They would come and stay at our house. So Stokely Carmichael came to give a speech, and Stokely and I were friends. We, were, in fact, Stokely gave me my first drink, Kool-Aid and gin. So we had a very warm relationship, and he was friends with my husband before I became friends. So he came to the house, he was going to stay, and he had second thoughts. And he said, I don't think it would be good, it wouldn't look right for me to stay at your house because of Butch, who was my husband. And then began conversation where a number of people tried to convince me to leave Butch because, as an activist in the civil rights movement, it just didn't look good where things had moved to. And I said, I married out of love, and that still exists. I'm not going to divorce for political reasons. So you're welcome to my house anytime you want, but I'm not changing my family life so that you can feel comfortable politically. I ran into, eventually, maybe 4 or 5 years after that, we moved to Africa and ran into friends that had been friends during the civil rights movement. And another guy said the same thing. He said he and his wife and I were really glad to bump into each other, surprised. We didn't know they were there. And I said, why don't you come over for dinner? And he said, well, are you still with Butch? And I said, yeah. And he said, I don't go to the homes of white people. I said, all right, it's your loss. So that was a kind of a cultural change that was a little difficult to deal with. I felt caught in the middle in the sense that, I had isolation and hostility from white people in my high school and middle school years. And now I was getting it from the other side. It confirmed to me, though, that I was a person who has to just stake out my own trail. That, I wasn't going to decide what was right or wrong for me based on what other people thought, but on the conclusions that I came to. And I find those divisions still exist to this day, that there are some people that are just open, and there are some people who are not. And one of the things that I noticed once I began to raise my family, 4 children, mixed race children, 2 adopted, 2 that I gave birth to, is that their peers knew very little about the civil rights movement, knew very little about activism, did not know their history. My kids did because they were raised in our family. They couldn't escape it. And they knew what Butch and I had done when we were in college and what we continued to do. In fact, we demonstrated because when we first moved to this area as a family, Denny's was segregated. Or not segregated. We could go in there and eat, but they weren't hiring black employees. And so we demonstrated with other like-minded people until Denny's closed. It came back years later, maybe 20 years later, and it came back hiring black people. So although the results were not immediate, we did see them happen. So the children participated in demonstrations locally and understood the purpose, the reason, the strategy, all of that. But their friends appeared to be clueless. And the more I had to do with young people who did not know the history, the sadder I became about how it seemed that things were sliding back. All because, and I didn't know, all because up here, the children were not being raised with that historical information. I didn't know what was happening in the South. So I didn't know whether kids had more of a connection with the history in the South or not. But I did know that up here, I wasn't seeing it. Then I really do connect this with the cell phone, the information about police brutality, about all of the ways in which black people were being treated violently, being singled out unfairly, all of these things that we knew. When I say we who had been active all along and hadn't really given it up, knew. Now younger people were discovering, because they could take pictures on their cell phone. They could post it on social media. They could discuss it and realize that this was wrong. That, I think, was really a helpful tool in opening people's eyes and so that, and put the injustice right in your face. That people began to see that this is not something that is past and over and done with, that this is still going on, and that somebody's got to do something. And if not you, who is it going to be? You can't sit back and complain about a situation unless you're willing to get involved. So I see that Black Lives Matter is sort of the child of the civil rights movement, although they may not feel that way. They may feel but it's just, I think with every generation, my generation didn't really know what our parents had done until later, and found out that our parents were involved in protest movements of their own, and that they took us as far as they could go, and then we picked up the trail and moved ahead with our own ways. And now our grandchildren really, and I wondered about this seeming to skip a generation, that my grandchildren are very outspoken. They attend demonstrations, they plan demonstrations, they know more about what's going on than I do. But my own children, they fostered this in their children, but they were not activists. They were proud of what we had done and would boast about, my mother was doing this, my dad did that,
And they
But
participated in the Denny's.
right,
So
right.
they had that little bit.
Yeah, yeah. And but I think they had to have said things to their children that made their children really strong and outspoken and I would love to find out, was it a skip generation? Because the people that are involved in Black Lives Matter in an organizational sense are my granddaughter's peers. So they're of that generation. We, the elders, dealing with the challenges of age, we're out there as much as we can be, but I think we also realize that how is the next generation going to learn to do these things if we don't step back and let them? And so, they may make mistakes, or they may have realizations and information and knowledge that we, from our perspective, don't have in the same way. So it's wonderful, and I support it any way I can. So looking at why is it that my grandchildren are activists in a way that my children were not, I think some of it is social media in the sense that the information is out there, and it's out there so fast that it takes your breath away. I mean, something can happen at 10 in the morning, and by 11 or 12, the whole United States may have heard about it. My generation, we found out what was happening either from people who came back and said, I was in such and such a place and this happened, which meant a little time went by, or from newspapers and magazines. But the newspapers were not neutral, so you didn't always get the information that you needed to have from the newspapers. So I think this generation, the Black Lives Matter generation, has much more awareness of what's going on. And I know that the way Facebook operates. If you show interest in something, you will get more information about that. So I can only believe that their feeds are inundated with things that are going on. And as long as they don't have, now what I have seen is as they begin raising their families, their activism slows down a little bit because they can't go to jail. They got to come home to the kids. You know, that there's this generational stuff that determines the nature of your involvement. Not whether or not you'll be involved, but just how you'll be involved, to what extent. You know, if you have a job to go to, you know, then you've got to sort of make priorities. But I think it's a good time for change to come about. And the other thing that I see is that while the older generation may still be somewhat rigid in looking at mixed race people or people races mixing, that the younger generation, it's become almost commonplace that people are adopting children of all different races. They are marrying people on the media. You see so many commercials that will show mixed race families or couples. So all of this is becoming part of the normal background in life. The challenge is to hang on to it, because while I may be looking at it as a positive thing, there are also those very conservative people who want to roll back the clock and see this as bad. So I'm hoping that the combination of activism and just the way progress is occurring socially will bring us to a day when we won't have to do this kind of protesting. I write poetry because in an almost dreamlike sense, these poems come to me unsolicited. And I have always liked them. I never studied poetry, and much of the poetry that I have read, I haven't cared for. But these, like dreams, come to me, and I feel like I have to write them down. I'm at the age now where I think about legacy, and that I had written all of these poems for over 50 years, and I wanted to share them with my children and my grandchildren. I also wanted them to know that we are a creative family, and that if there's something that you want to do, you can do it. You know, you can write a book with your
role model.
right. So the other thing I found is that I would, from time to time, participate in poetry readings, and I always got both positive feedback and people asking, "Where is my book?" And I would always feel embarrassed that I didn't have a book. So now I do. I can go to poetry readings and I can say, "Oh, I brought my book with me." Yeah. I'm in connection with this. I'm working on an audio book because another friend said, if you do an audio book, your grandchildren and great-grandchildren will have your voice as well as your words. So that's my next project that I'm working on.